So today we're going to start solving quadratics, and we're going to do this several different ways, but today we're going to solve specifically by factoring and square rooting. So that's two things that really we've already done in Algebra 1, but we're going to review and do again here in Algebra 2 as well. So let's go ahead and get started. We have these two problems here, and I'm going to start by solving the first one. Each time you do these, you might want to pause the video, try to solve it on your own first, and then see if you've done it correctly by restarting the video and watching me go through it. But I'm gonna factor a greatest common factor out of this expression, and it looks like 5 is something that goes into 10 and 5. So I'm going to pull out a 5 and a w, and then I'm going to multiply the 5w times two things that give me these two things. So 5w times 2w is 10w squared. And then 5w times 1 is just 5w. So I've factored this by pulling out the GCF, greatest common factor, and now I have two things. This times this is equal to 0, and if that's the case, one of those two things has to be equal to 0, which means either the 5w is 0 or the 2w plus 1 is equal to 0. And then I'm going to solve both of those equations. The first equation I'll divide by 5, which means w is 0 divided by 5, which is 0. Second equation, I would subtract 1 from both sides, so I'll have 2w is equal to negative 1, and if I divide both sides then by 2, w is equal to negative 1/2. And so that's the solution for the first equation, and we could check these by plugging 0 and negative 1/2 back into the original equation to make sure that we do get 0. So let's go ahead and work on number 2. You can pause the video and then restart it to make sure that you know how to do these, but I'm going to factor this one. Doesn't look like there's a greatest common factor, so I'm just going to pull out and factor this into two binomials. So I will have something times something that gives me x squared, and that's x times x. And then I want something here and here that multiply together to give me negative 18, but add to a negative 3. And so I'm going to put in a negative 6 and a positive 3, because negative 6 times positive 3 is negative 18. Negative 6x plus 3x then does give me negative 3x. So then I'm going to set both of those equal to 0, because one of them must be equal to 0. So if both of those are equal to 0, we're going to have x minus 6 equals 0, or we could have x plus 3 is equal to 0. And if I solve both of those here, I'm going to add 6 to both sides, so x is equal to 6. And then here I would subtract 3 from both sides, so x is equal to negative 3. And those are our solutions. All right, let's move on. Let's try something a little bit more difficult here. This should be equal to 0 here. And so I'm going to solve the first one. This is a little bit more difficult because we have the 2 out in front, but I'm going to factor this. There's nothing that is in common between the 2 and the 7, or even the 2x squared and the 6. And so I'm just going to put down a 2x times x. That's the only thing that gives me 2x squared. And then I want something here and here that multiply together to give me 6. So I have a bunch of options. I have 6 and 1, I have 2 and 3, but somehow I want to position them so that when I check my inside terms and my outside terms, I get a negative 7x in the middle. So I think if I put negative 3 here and a negative 2 here, negative 3 times negative 2 does give me a positive 6. And then this is negative 3x. That's my inside terms. My outside terms give me a negative 4x. And a negative 4x and a negative 3x do add up to negative 7x. And so this is equal to 0. And so then one of those has to be equal to 0. Either the 2x minus 3 is equal to 0, or the x minus 2 is equal to 0. So the first equation, if I add 3 to both sides, 2x will equal 3. Divide by 2, and x is going to equal 3 halves. And here the second equation, if I add 2 to both sides, then I'll have x equals 2. And so my two answers are 2 and 3 halves. Let's take a look at the example number 4. First thing I would probably look at is see if there's anything that they have in common. And there isn't anything that goes into 3 and 16 and 12. So I'm going to have to factor this similarly to the way I did number 3. I'm going to pull out maybe a 3x times an x, because that's the only thing I can think of that gives me a 3x squared. then I'm going to have to figure out something here and here that multiply together to give me 12, but somehow when I take my first terms and my last terms, it adds up to a negative 16. So I could try 12 and 1, I could try 6 and 2, I could try 4 and 3, and let's see, I'm going to stick with, let's say, 3 and 4 is not going to do it, so it looks like maybe a 6 and a 2. If I put the 2 here and the 6 here, and I make this negative and this positive, I will have a positive 2 times a negative 6 gives me negative 12, but then 2 times x is 2x, 3x times negative 6 is negative 18x, and when I add those two things together, it does give me a negative 16x in the middle. And these are equal to 0. So then I'm going to set both of those equal to 0. Either the 3x plus 2 is going to be 0, or the x minus 6 is going to be 0. The first equation, if I subtract 2 from both sides, I'll have 3x equals negative 2, and if I divide by 3, it's going to be negative 2/3. The second equation, if I add 6 to both sides, my solution will be x equals 6. And so my solution is either x is 6 or x is negative 2/3. Let's move on here. Now, if we take a look at number 5, and I start to factor this like I've done the others, something that gives me 25x squared is 5x times 5x. But then I want something that multiplies together to give me an 81, like maybe a positive 9 and a positive 9 equals 0. And so 9 times 5x, that's 45x. 5x times 9 is also 45x, and if I add them together, I do get 90x in the middle. And so that means one of those has to be equal to 0, but they're the same thing. So 5x plus 9 equals 0, or 5x plus 9 equals 0. I would get the same answer twice. So I'm going to subtract 9 from both sides. So 5x is equal to negative 9. And if I divide by 5, x is going to equal negative 9/5. So that is an example of something that only has one solution, which is negative 9/5. Take a look at number 6. Can't factor anything out. They don't have anything in common. So there's really two ways I could do number 6. The first thing that I could do is I could factor this. I could write it as 3x times 3x gives me 9x squared, and a positive 8 times a negative 8, that gives me negative 64. But I don't have a middle term here. And so that makes sense because here I have 8 times 3 is 24x. 3 times negative 8 is negative 24x, and those two things cancel each other out, equals 0. So then either 3x plus 8 is equal to 0, or 3x minus 8 is equal to 0. So the first one, if I subtract 8 from both sides, I'll get 3x equals negative 8, and if I divide by 3, it's going to be negative 8/3. The second one, if I add 8 to both sides, I'll get 3x equals positive 8. And if I divide by 3, x equals positive 8/3. And so that's one way to do that problem, but I can also do that another way. Because it doesn't have a middle term, I could have just added the 64 to the other side and got 9x squared equals positive 64. Then I could divide by 9. And so if I divide both sides by 9, I want to get that x squared by itself. I'll have x squared equals 8. Let me start over here. So if we move on to number 7, I'm going to have to start this one by first getting it equal to 0. And so I will have 2x squared plus 4x minus 6 equals 0. I could divide everything here by 2. And if I did that, I would have x squared plus 2x minus 3 is equal to 0. Then if I factor this, I'll have x times x gives me x squared. A positive 3 and a negative 1 multiply together to give me negative 1. And 3x minus x does give me 2x. And so now I can go ahead and set both of these equal to 0. X plus 3 is equal to 0, or x minus 1 is equal to 0. And here I would subtract 3 from both sides and get x equals negative 3. Here I would add 1 to both sides and get x equals negative 1. And so my two solutions here are x equals -3 and x equals 1. Well, let's take a look at number 8. Number 8, I could begin by dividing everything by 3. Just to make it a little bit simpler, if I divide everything by 3, this is going to be x squared minus 8 equals 0. If I add 8 to both sides, there isn't a middle term here, so I could do this one by square rooting. I'm just going to add 8 to both sides, so x squared equals 8. If I take the square root of both sides, I'll have x equals plus or minus the square root of 8. But I can simplify that. The square root of 8 is the same thing as the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. And the square root of 4 is just 2. And so this equals plus or minus 2 radical 2. There's my answer for number 8. Let's move on and take a look at the last question here. Last question, let me get rid of some of this stuff. The last question is about free falling from a parachute. So we have a parachute, it's free falls until he hits 1,000 feet. Then he pulls the cord and hopefully the parachute will open and he can float on down to the ground. So we're given this equation. That represents his height as he free falls. The question is, how many seconds did the parachutist get to free fall before he hit 1,000 feet? So that means we're going to set this equal to 1,000. And so we have -16 t squared, I'm going to call it x squared, plus 1,600. That equals 1,000. And I'm going to start by getting this equal to 0. Actually, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to, because there is no middle term, I'm just going to subtract 1,600 from both sides. And so I'll have -16x squared equals 1,000 divided by 1,600 is -600. Well, then I can divide everything by -16. And if I divide everything by -16, I'll have x squared equals 37.5. Then if I take the square root of both sides, x will equal plus or minus the square root of 37.5, which is really close to 6.1. Now this particular example, we probably don't need the plus or minus there because we're not going to free fall for -6.1 seconds. We're going to free fall for about 6.1 seconds. And there we go. As you work through your homework assignment, you're going to have problems that you're going to solve both by factoring or possibly by using the square root. And the square root only works if there's like a quadratic term but no linear term. So good luck with that. We'll go over questions that you have tomorrow in class.